Hey guys, Chef Hawks here again. Welcome to another episode of ProStart, and now we are in Chapter 18. We're looking at cooking methods. Now, depending on where you are on the planet, and depending on the history and any other influences that may come into your life or into your region's life, may depend upon the different kinds of cooking methods that are used. And this can vary all over the world, and this is what makes culinary such an amazing thing, is that it draws the world together with all of these different kinds of concepts. So let's dig in.
Cooking and heat transfer. Heat is a kind of energy that everything has. Heat will be transferred from something that has a lot of heat energy to something that has less heat energy. If you put an egg into hot water, the egg will get hotter and the water will get a little cooler, because some of the water's heat energy is being transferred into the egg. There are many ways of imparting heat into the foods we cook, which are affected by two factors: the kind of heat and the moisture used in the cooking process. There are three kinds of heat: conduction, convection, and radiation. Conduction is the transferal of heat through direct contact. When you place a steak on a hot pan, heat will transfer from the pan directly into the steak. Conduction is a rapid method of transferring high heat into foods, but can overcook the outside of the food before the inside has reached the right temperature. Convection is the indirect transfer of heat into a food through a medium. A medium is something that transfers the energy from the heat source into itself and then passes it onto the food. This is usually air, water, or oil. An oven heats the air inside it. The air then transfers the heat into the food. The main difference between conduction and convection is that conduction transfers heat through solid objects, while convection transfers heat through a liquid or gas. Lastly, there is radiation, which is very different to conduction and convection because it doesn't need to make any contact with the food in order to transfer heat. When something gets very hot, it radiates heat as waves. You can feel the heat of a flame without actually touching it. This is because it is giving off radiant heat. The waves of radiant heat will continue traveling outward until it comes in contact with an object, at which point the wave is absorbed as heat. The ability to penetrate food varies between each of these types of heat, so you must consider this when choosing a cooking method. Now let's look at the effect that moisture has on the cooking process. Liquids are able to transfer heat much more effectively than air because they make better contact with the food and therefore have more opportunity to transfer their heat. Liquids can penetrate into the food and add flavor and moisture. Liquids will impair your ability to brown food. Water has a maximum temperature of 100 degrees Celsius. Hotter than that, and it will turn to steam. So when we cook, we need to decide if it will be more suitable to use dry heat, wet heat, or some other kind of heat, such as microwaves, as this will have a major impact on the finished dish.
So yes, let's look at heat transfer. So we use two different major methods of cooking, and then a third which we use in a few instances. But for the most part, most of the time when we're cooking, we are either cooking with a dry heat cooking method or a moist heat cooking method. Sometimes we'll use combination cooking as well, and we're going to go into that, but that will be a combination of dry and moist. We'll go into that a little bit later on. So now we've learned about the type of energy that we have and the transfer via either conduction, going directly through a solid, so in a skillet or a saucepan of some sort, or convection, where it's either going through the air, or it's going through oil, or it's going through a liquid, maybe a stock or water, and radiation, where it doesn't need to go through anything, it actually just passes directly from the heat source directly to the food itself. So one other form of radiation we can also consider when it comes to when it comes to this is microwaves. So a microwave doesn't actually heat up the food itself. It agitates the water molecules that are in the food. As you can see on this diagram here, we have the magnetron up here, which is what produces the microwaves, and this goes through and then literally reverberates all the way through inside the cooking chamber. And as these hit onto the food, it agitates the water molecules. Those water molecules start to vibrate, literally, and they start rubbing against one another, and it's that friction, it's that movement of those water molecules that starts to create steam inside the food. One big thing that is different with microwaving is it does not create browning on your foods, and the problem is it can tend to dry out foods or make them tough and rubbery. We don't generally get good even cooking when it comes to a microwave. Let's take a look at our dry heat cooking methods. So we have it with and without fat. So without fat, that includes things like broiling, grilling, roasting, and baking. And with fat includes sauteing, pan frying, stir frying, and deep frying. So take a look at broiling. So you can see a great photograph right here of the broiler element at the top of the oven. The heat is coming from above, and it's a high heat. It's a high intense heat, which is cooking this food. So the food is browned on top, and so you'll have to turn it to actually have it continue to cook for the other side as well. This is perfect for things like tender cuts of meat, young poultry, fish, and some fruits and vegetables as well. So you'll preheat the broiler. You'll either oil the broiler or the item itself, and then you place the item on the grid in that broiler cavity. Then you can adjust the distance between the actual heat source and the food itself. Generally with these broilers you cannot adjust the temperature. It's more about the distance between the food and the element that will actually dictate just how hot the food is going to get and how much heat it's going to receive. You turn it over halfway through because that heat is only coming from one direction, so you need to turn the food in order to have it get even cooking all the way through. Let's take a look at grilling. So grilling is a simple dry heat method. It's similar. You need to have similar sized pieces of food that you're cooking so that they cook evenly, and you cook on a grill rack which is above the heat source. So you can't do any liquids on there because otherwise the liquids will literally fall straight through the grill rack. And you're going to use possibly small amounts of fat or oil on the foods to add some flavor and to add some moisture to the food as well. You would have a highly flavored outside when you're grilling things because it's getting that slightly smoky kind of charred flavor. With a moist inside is preferable. If not, then you've probably overcooked it. You want to create some cross-hatching. I've got a photograph in a moment that I can show you of exactly what that is. But you can also use some special woods like mesquite, hickory, apple, that add certain types of smoky flavors. And you also possibly want to use some marinades as well to maintain the moisture in the food you're cooking and to add some unique different flavors to it as well. So when we're using the grill, you want to clean, which is very important. You want to have those bars be nice and clean, so we brush those off and then preheat that grill. You want to have it so it's hot so that the food doesn't stick to it. You want to be able to season the actual food items before they go on, so that the seasoning sticks, and then marinate or brush on with oil as well. This will help it to not stick, but it will also help to add more flavor and moisture to the foods as well. You place the items on the grill, and then you leave them. Let them stay right where they are. If you immediately try to move them, they will stick and they'll start to tear and damage the quality of the meat that you have on there. Let them stay. Give them at least about a minute so that it properly sears, so that it will release. You're then going to flip them over. Remember when we talked about turning at 60 degrees to get cross-hatching? This is exactly what we're talking about here. By turning at 60 degrees, you get this fantastic grill mark pattern called cross-hatching. And you cooked to the desired doneness. We're going to talk more about doneness a little later on. When it comes to roasting, you want to it's basically using hot, dry air and you're going to have it where the outer layers of the food is actually going to receive all of that heat. Say if it's a turkey that's roasting in the oven, the outer layers receive that hot, dry air roasting the outside. What happens is then the juices that are naturally inside that turkey will steam all the way through to the center. But you must make sure that you have an appropriate temperature so that it will be given the opportunity to roast all the way through without drying the outside. That's where some of the technicalities come in. So this is a perfect method to be able to cook things like fish, tender meats, and poultry, and then some fruits and vegetables as well. You can cover it or leave it fully uncovered, depending upon exactly what the product is and as to what needs it has to successfully roast. And also, you may have some items that require longer cooking times. When you're looking at a turkey, you may be looking at a couple of hours or more to get that turkey fully cooked to the right temperature. Again, we're going to go more into that later on as well. So food will be raised off the cooking pan as well. So this is where a prevail comes in, that you would place a barrier between the roasting pan and that turkey, say, if that's what you were cooking, just so that the bottom of that turkey isn't getting overcooked from conduction hitting the base of that turkey. You also want to have some basting done. Basting is when we take the juices that have dripped off that product and we pick them up with a spoon and we'll pour it right back over the top of the meat, and this is called basting. You should expect with roasting to have a golden brown exterior and a moist and tender interior. So let's take a look at an example of if we're roasting this turkey. So you want to season it. If you're going to stuff the cavity, then you can do that as well. That then brings in a whole new layer of care where we must make sure that we hit a correct core and internal temperature. We'll talk more about that later as well. And you may want to marinate it, just to give some additional flavor and an additional moisture level to the meat as well. You place that on a rack in a roasting pan, so you can actually see right here, we have this rack that's just that it's sitting on top of. This is so that it will not just fry the base of it as that turkey starts to cook. We have to make sure that we're aware when we're cooking this, either covered or uncovered, that there will be carryover cooking. What's carryover cooking? So when you remove this turkey from the oven, it's going to have a significant amount of heat energy still in it. Well, so probably for another 20 or 30 minutes, this turkey is going to continue to cook just from that residual heat that's in there. That is what we call carryover cooking. Before we carve this turkey, we want to make sure that we're going to allow the meat to rest. And we're going to prepare a pan gravy with the drippings that we get in the bottom of the pan that we've roasted in. And then we can go ahead and carve it up. Let's take a step back though. Resting the turkey before we carve. What exactly do we mean by resting meats? Let's take a look.
Welcome to FudeHouse. Resting a steak. Do you do it? You should. Resting are those crucial golden minutes after you cook something where you will yourself not to dig in. Letting any kind of meat rest after you cook it will make it 100 to 200 times better. Don't believe me? Let's do a little kitchen experiment. Let's take these two pieces of meat and season them up exactly the same, with salt and pepper. This is our control, and this is our variable. They're going to get the exact same treatment. Sear them on both sides in a hot cast iron pan and finish in the oven. Now, there are a lot of opinions out there about how you should rest. On wood, on plastic, on ceramic, on a rack, covered in tinfoil, blah, blah, blah. Don't worry about all that. Just get it out of whatever you cooked it in, or else that residual heat will overcook your food. This one is going to rest for 10 minutes, and I'm going to cut this one right away. Now, what's going on here? You see, when you cook a steak, or any meat for that matter, you're putting that protein under stress. Muscle fibers are shortening and contracting, moisture is heating and expanding, and thusly you're causing pressure to build up inside the meat. Forces pushing in, forces pushing out, just looking for release. Cutting the steak in this state would be giving all that meaty, liquid, and easy superhighway right out of there. But by resting the steak, you're letting that pressure subside. The muscle fibers relax, and that feisty activity inside the meat calms down. The juices redistribute from freaking out on the edges to cozying up into the center. Now when you cut, the muscle isn't so concerned about squeezing liquid out, and the liquid isn't so concerned about escaping. They're happy to live together. Look at that, this one peed all over the place, and it's already dry. Over here, all that juice is still in there, and it's not coming out. There's better color, better juiciness, better doneness, better eating.
So perfectly put, when you allow that meat to rest, whether it's a turkey or a steak or any other meats that you're preparing, when you allow it to rest, it's allowing all those juices to find their equilibrium again, to come back in, to allow that meat to relax. And the fact is, when you allow that to happen, it's not going to allow anywhere near as much of the moisture from inside that meat to pour out onto your chopping board. It's going to stay in the meat. You're going to have meat which is going to actually look much more evenly cooked, because you're not going to have quite so much sear on the outside and coolness on the inside. It's going to be evened out. The meat overall will look great. It's going to taste even better. Griddling. So griddling is when we are cooking something on a hot, flat surface. We have a couple of griddles in our kitchen here at the Career Center, and they're great. They're both cast iron. They don't stick at all because they've been seasoned well, but they're really great to be able to go and cook various different things, kind of like griddle cakes, steaks, chops, chicken breast. We've done all sorts of different things on there. So it's where we have a dry, heavy-bottomed frying pan or cast iron skillet, and we're using that to have even golden brown finishes, a slightly crisp exterior to these products, because you have direct contact with the food there. So we have conduction heating that's happening when we are griddling. Sauteing. So saute is a French word, S-A-U-T-E, with the accent over the E. So that literally means to jump in French. So this is where we are cooking food rapidly. We have it in a hot skillet, in a hot frying pan, which has sides which taper out, so that it allows for us to actually skip the food around in that pan. You're going to cook food very rapidly in there, and so because of that, the water and vitamin loss is much lower, because we're not cooking the food for a significant length of time when we are sauteing. You're going to add a high amount of color and flavor with the blistering that occurs when you're cooking at such a high temperature. Generally, you use a small amount of fat, just enough just to coat the pan, adds a little flavor, and it helps it to not stick. We're always using high heats on here, so this is perfect for select cuts of meats, chickens, fish, and seafood. So let's take a look at how this exactly works. So you pull all your mise en place together. We have all of our prep work together, everything in its place, and everything has its place. So we cut the food into appropriate size pieces, and so they're all not just cut into smaller pieces, but they are cut into very similar size pieces as well, so that they cook evenly. Remember, this is going to be a fast-moving process, so we want to make sure that smaller pieces don't overcook while larger pieces are still undercooked. Select the correct pan, and so as I was saying, these tapered edge that moves out a little like this, that's exactly what you want, because it gives the ability to skip the food off the edge and to drop back down. We want to have this food jumping, literally, as the word dictates, to jump. So we're going to use a high to medium heat while we're cooking it with minimal fat in there. We preheat that pan. This will help things to not stick on there. Place a thin layer of food on there, as you can see in the second photograph right down here, and then we're going to allow that food to brown. Stir frying. So stir frying isn't that dissimilar. We're again using a small amount of fat, but as you can see in here, we're really making this food jump. Stir frying is all about a high heat temperature with very, very rapid cooking. And if you look at a wok, because this is what we generally do most stir frying in, there's a lot of surface area here. There's a lot of surface contactability that you have here. And that's why we actually are keeping food dancing in here very rapidly. That's why it's called stir fry, because we never let it stay still. And you're searing from one side to another side to another side. You're stirring it very quickly, and then you're using a sauce that you would create in the pan itself to go with the meats and the vegetables that you're cooking in there. This is perfect for different meats and vegetables that are bite-sized pieces. So let's take a little look about the process of stir frying. So of course, again, we're pulling in our mise en place. We have all of our prep work together, and then we're using a small amount of oil. We have that the wok or a large saute pan will work as well, and we're preheating that up. We're adding the main item in there, and then we're stir frying. We're constantly moving that around. Add any additional ingredients, because obviously you want to make sure that any of the softer ingredients are added after the ingredients that are going to take significantly longer, so that everything, by the time it comes to fruition, is cooked together at the same time. And then adding any liquids in after that, and any kind of a thickener if you're looking to make a sauce that needs a thickening agent to it as well, and then serving it immediately. Pan frying. So this will be where we're going to be cooking in oil. So this is going to be frying, but on a shallow basis. So with this, we're going to be using a less intense heat. We don't want to hit the smoking temperature, the smoking point of oil, if we're starting to use an actual level of oil in our frying pan. We're going to be coating food with a batter or possibly seasoned flour or some kind of breading to protect the actual food itself. It's going to make a really flavorful exterior when it crisps up nice and golden brown. And then also we're going to have the juices and the flavor will be retained inside there as well, that's protected around that outer layer. Beef tenderloin and fish fillets are a perfect example of this. So let's look at how we go about this. So again, we're pulling together our mise en place. Mise en place is key to everything we do to be successful in the kitchen. We're going to fill that frying pan about 2/3 full. We never want to fill it up too high so that there's a possibility that things could splash over and create a fire or any kind of hazard like that. And we're using either oil or a fat to 2/3 fill our pan. We're going to heat that to about 350. So this is very important, that we don't want to be going too much above this type of temperature. Otherwise we could hit that smoke point and we could actually endanger ourselves with a fire issue. But also, a key part when we're cooking like this, we want to make sure that we are cooking the food to the outside being nice and golden brown, but the inside being cooked through. 350 degrees for a lot of foods is the perfect temperature to be able to do this and not crisp up the outside to where it's overcooked and have things still be raw on the inside. So once you preheat it, you're adding the food item in there, and you're pan frying the first side, and then turning that over and cooking to the desired doneness. We'll again talk about doneness towards the end. And then you want to make sure you drain it on absorbent paper. You don't want to have the grease dripping out from that food. And then you're going to season and serve that food and garnish with a sauce. Deep frying. So this is where we're going to be bread or batter coating that food to protect it again. And you're going to actually be immersing the food in that hot fat. You're going to create a nice crispy coating on the outside. The interior will be nice and moist and tender. So you've got two different things here. We can batter them or we can bread them. When you're battering it, it combines wet and dry ingredients together. So primarily dry ingredients would be something like flour or cornmeal. And then the liquid would be maybe beer, milk, water to create a batter that you would then dip into before you go ahead and fry. Generally using some kind of binder like egg. When it comes to breading, then use the same components as batter, except for we're not blending these together. We actually use them separately. Let's take a look at how this is done.
So deep frying itself is a dry heat cooking method. Here's some French fries here. Even though the food is submerged, some frozen onion rings, even though the food is submerged in a liquid, it's dry heat method because the heat is being conducted from the fat to the food. Also, oil and fat can get to a much higher temperature than water, which will never go above 212 degrees Fahrenheit. So the double basket method would be to insert one basket on top of the other one to keep the food completely submerged in the hot fat. Another method of frying in a deep fat fryer is the swimming method, which is where you put the food directly in without a basket or anything. And then you'll need a skimmer to get the food out when it's finished cooking. This is generally used for breaded items. So these finished cooking, we'll just drain them on a paper towel. That'll just help absorb off some of the remaining fat that's dripping off of them, preventing them from getting soggy and greasy. A breaded item being surrounded by the hot fat retains a certain amount of crispness that seals it from actually soaking up any of that grease. A deep fried food should never be greasy. So these are done. You turn these over with the dripping end of the basket away from you so you don't fling any droplets of hot oil on yourself. Then you would just season in the bowl. And you can hold things like French fries on the line under a heat lamp for a short period of time. Right like that. And that is deep frying.
So when we're deep frying foods, you generally want to select things that are naturally tender. Make sure that the shape and the size are even, so we have, and they're smaller, so that we have quick cooking, but even cooking as well. 35% of the flavor from deep fried foods comes from the oil that you're actually cooking in. So obviously we have to make sure we have clean oil that we're using as well. And use good quality oils as you're doing this. It's very important for the quality of your food. So when you see foods floating, like we just saw the French fries as he lifted the second basket off the top, we saw that they were floating. And when we saw the onion rings floating, that's an indication that they're getting to where they are completed in cooking. You should see a nice golden brown color to them. We should be checking internal temperatures, especially on things like meats. If you're doing chicken tenders, something like that, you want to make sure you're hitting the appropriate core temperature of the foods that you're cooking. And it should have a nice crisp crust that's nice and delicate around the outside as well. So we looked at the swim method. This is where we're literally dropping the items directly into the oil rather than putting them into a basket, and then we can scoop them out with a skimmer after that. And then the basket method, where we're literally placing those French fries into the basket and dropping it down into the oil. And then the double basket method, where we actually place the second basket on top of the first to hold them evenly underneath the top level of that oil. This is used for things that especially tend to float a lot and don't get even cooking on the top that may not be fully exposed to the oil. Always, when you're deep frying, bear in mind recovery time. What is recovery time? That's the length of time that it takes for the oil to get back up to the correct temperature. Say if you're cooking some French fries at 350 degrees Fahrenheit, then make sure that when you put some frozen fries or even just some raw fries into that oil, make sure you bear in mind the fact is those raw fries will probably be at around about maybe about 65 degrees, and the frozen fries could be at 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're going to be significantly lower than the rest of the oil that you're placing them in, and it may take several minutes for your deep fat fryer to raise the temperature back up to where it needs to be. Always bearing in mind that smoke point. That's when fats and oils start to smoke and they break down. The quality of that oil is going to be damaged. You can also even get some toxic substances that can start developing in your oil when it's sitting at the smoking point as well. You want to make sure that you're using a high quality oil. Generally, most of the high quality oils that you use in a fryer will have about a 425 degree smoking point. You're looking for something to have neutral flavor and color, because it's more about what you're putting in to the fryer that it gives you that base flavor to work with. But let's take a look at a standard breading procedure. How does this work?
Hey everybody, Thomas Joseph here. Now, few people can resist a crisp, golden chicken cutlet like this one here. But the real conundrum is that most people experience something like this, where the breading or the coating that you're using is falling off. Well, today I'm going to show you the trick to breading chicken cutlets, pork cutlets, or even fish, and it's called the standard breading procedure. And you will have success in breading every single time. It starts with 3 shallow dishes. The first one is going to have flour, the second one is going to have eggs, and the third is going to have whatever coating you'd like. So I'm using panko breadcrumbs today, but you could use anything from cornflakes to breadcrumbs. The possibilities are endless here. To start, I'm going to use chicken cutlets. Pat the cutlets dry with some paper towel, absorb any excess moisture. If you're doing cutlets like I am today and you're going to bread them, then you want to make sure that they're cut or they're pounded out to about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 of an inch thickness so that they cook evenly and consistently in the oil. So now what I'm going to do is season my mixtures. A little bit of salt and pepper, and this should go into each of your dishes. You want to season every single layer in the breading process. Otherwise, you're going to end up with a flavorless cutlet. And I'm going to crack maybe 2 eggs into this shallow dish here. And I'm just going to whisk the eggs right into the salt and pepper, just until the seasoning is evenly incorporated with the egg here. And then with your flour, you can just mix it together with your hands. If you really wanted to amp up the flavor here, you could use Cajun seasoning, you could use an herb blend, anything you would like, you can mix in here for flavor. So I'm going to mix up the breadcrumbs I have here, and now I'm going to even season the cutlets themselves. Not too liberal with the salt and pepper because these are so thin, and we're already seasoning all of the layers of the breading. And now to start the standard breading procedure. Now, cutlets into the flour first, and just so your hands don't get breaded in the process, use 1 hand for dry and 1 hand for wet. So what the flour does is it adds a dry layer to the chicken cutlet, which will help the egg mixture adhere to it. And of course, the egg mixture is what helps the breadcrumbs stick to the cutlets themselves. So it's all about this 3-step process, and the breadcrumbs or that crust that you're creating will really stick onto your cutlet. So this is my wet hand. You don't want too much egg and you don't want too much flour, so let it drip off and then into the breadcrumbs here. Take your dry hand and you can kind of fold the breadcrumbs up onto the chicken cutlet itself. I'm using panko breadcrumbs, and these are Japanese-style breadcrumbs, and they have a really crisp texture, and they add an extra crunch to the final product. Give it a slight, gentle pat, and then this goes on to a wire rack, and the secret is chilling the cutlets in the refrigerator for about 30 minutes, and what that does is it helps the crust bond together. It will not fall off during the cooking process, so into the refrigerator for about 30 minutes.
So yes, so you set up your assembly line, as it were. You always make sure you have 1 hand for the wet, 1 hand for the dry. So you got your eggs are the wet, your dry hand is going to be for both breadcrumbs and the flour. And so you're going to go through flour first to create a very light coating, brush it off, then into the egg with your other hand, just a little egg on there but fully coating it, and then going over dry hand again into your breadcrumbs, and then just giving it a gentle pat down on there, and then you can actually store that in the refrigerator or in the freezer. But if you put it onto a lined pan, then it won't rip off that layer that you've now created around it. Make sure you always discard your unused flour, egg wash, and breadcrumbs afterwards, because you don't know how much contamination may have happened. If you're breading something like chicken, then that could be a significant cross-contamination problem if you then went to bread something else. So only ever using that once and using it specifically for that product that you're going to be cooking. So we're deep frying anywhere from about 325 up to 375. So this is where you're going to be adding the food item into that basket. You may need to turn it if necessary, if it's not already kind of bobbing around by itself. You might even need to finish an item off in the oven if it's significantly larger, that it won't fully cook without going too brown in the fryer itself. And then place it on a rack or on some absorbent paper afterwards, so that you try and get rid of some of the fat that's on that food. You don't want to have greasy food, you want to have nice crispy food. It should be seasoned and served with a sauce or a garnish. Let's now move on to moist heat cooking methods. So this is where you generally will have delicately flavored moist foods. So we're talking about simmering, poaching, shallow poaching, blanching, and steaming. Let's jump in here. So simmering. When we think about boiling water, in general, we don't really boil things in culinary arts because we're a lot more controlled. Boiling just means that water is hitting 212 Fahrenheit, the point of boiling, and so the problem is that that's completely out of control, and it can actually be detrimental to some foods that you might be cooking. So at the top, we would be cooking by simmering at the top of the temperature scale there, which is between 185 and 205, so right below boiling. And you can see a comparison right here. You don't need to necessarily have a thermometer in the water to check it, but if it's boiling, then you see these uncontrolled bubbles just rolling away. If it's simmering, you just got a few bubbles rising up to the top and breaking the surface. So they're just gently coming up. You want to have a well-flavored liquid. So depending upon exactly what it is, you could be using something like stock or wine, or it could just be water, but you may be adding some other items to it to flavor that water up. Maybe some kind of acid like vinegar or wine, or you may be adding some seasonings in there as well. You can use less tender cuts of meat when you are simmering, because this can actually slowly and gently break down the meat to make it more tender. So we're never boiling because you can make that meat stringy and rubbery. It actually will draw out more of the oils and the fats that are in that meat, leaving it drier. Poaching. So poaching is when we are even more controlled. We're actually going down another step here. Temperature between about 160 and 180. We're looking to have just a little bit of surface motion, but we're not having bubbles breaking the surface of the water. You can just see those convection currents kind of moving around gently in the water, and that's all. So you want to have a well-flavored liquid, maybe putting some vinegar in there, something like that, some seasoning in there as well. You're going to be using very tender foods, things like chicken, seafood, and in this case, eggs.
The word poach means to cook in simmering water. It comes from the French word poche, meaning pouch after the shape of a poached egg. Oh, not very pouch-like, are they? Probably taste great, though. Or maybe not. Looks like you could use some poached egg tips. Let's begin with your pan. A wide non-stick skillet is perfect for egg poaching because it gives you room to work and a nice slick surface for the eggs to settle on. You're also going to need 1.5 inches of water, no less and no more, and you're going to need to bring it to a bare simmer. Now the eggs. Now since their membranes are stronger and less likely to break, fresh eggs are best. Now if you want to know how old your eggs really are, take a look at the end of the box for a 3-digit number representing the 365 days of the year. Since this one says 057, we know they were packed on February 26th. Break each egg into a small custard cup. By the way, those cloudy whites are a sure sign of freshness. Now grab yourself a thermometer and a slotted spoon suitable for a non-stick vessel. When the water hits 190 degrees, you're ready to go. First, we want to get those little bubbles off of the bottom because they can create divots in the bottom of the eggs. Last addition, a tablespoon of white wine vinegar will help to coagulate the outside of the whites faster, giving us a better shape. Now, for insertion, you want to push the cup all the way into the water and slowly pour in the egg. Some of the water comes over into the cup, that's fine, doesn't matter. Smoothness is key here. Take your time. Water goes in, and then the egg goes in. Arranging them this way will also help you remember which one needs to come out the fastest. There, 4 go in. Good. Now, go ahead and set your timer for 4.5 minutes. And you want to maintain the heat so that you keep that to 190 degrees, no hotter. Basically, you should be able to stick your finger in and pull it back out without going, ow! Now, when the time is up, remove with the slotted spoon. You're just going to have to kind of jiggle it off at the bottom, but the non-stick will prevent any adhesion. There, it doesn't look really attractive now, but it will, don't worry. Now move those onto a towel or even a paper towel. The smoother is better because a coarse surface can actually make a permanent pattern on the eggs. That's okay if you don't mind that kind of thing. Now, as far as this jagged bit, just use your spoon and kind of curve around to remove that. That way you'll have a nice pouch shape. Now, if you're not going to eat them right away, you can move your poached eggs into ice water and refrigerate them for up to 8 hours. Then just to reheat them by putting them back into some hot water for about 1 minute. That's a good idea for parties. I'll be back. Now, as for serving, the traditional breakfast is, of course, fine, but dinner is an option too. I like mine on a nice tossed salad with a bit of vinaigrette, but that's just me.
Now we also move on to shallow poaching. So very similar to regular poaching now, what we saw with the egg and what you can use for various other different things too. But this is actually a method where we're going to have a combination of both steam and that liquid bath. So we're only going to have a thinner layer of water. We use this process when we want to gently poach something that may fall apart, that may break up. So this is when you're going to have portion sizes or small pieces of items that are just going to be partially covered by the liquid. Again, you're going to use some kind of an acid, wine, lemon juice, vinegar, something in that water to assist with the coagulation, with the cooking process. But you're going to make sure you have a lid that goes on top of that pan so that as you're cooking it, the rest of it will steam. So if you look at this, this is a great example of a poached. So this is fish. And so what's happened here, this has been stuffed. There's some crab stuffing inside here, and the fish has been rolled around this. And so if we go to cook this in a pan of water, where there's more water in there than we would have under a shallow poaching, then what would happen is this stuffing would break up and would just fall out. We'd end up with a cooking liquor that's just full of all of our stuffing. By doing it with only a very shallow amount of water or a very shallow amount of liquid that's in there, it actually gives us the ability to cook the food all the way through by steaming it, by placing the lid on top of that shallow poaching pan, allowing it to steam, and then afterwards we can pull that out, and it remains a nice solid piece without things being broken up on there. We then can take the cuisson, which is the liquid that's left in that saucepan, because there's only going to be a small amount left in there, and we can use that as a base of a sauce. So we can turn the temperature up after we take that piece of fish out and reduce down the amount of water that's in there, maybe add a little cream to make a wonderful cream sauce like we see in the picture here. So how do we go about shallow poaching? So after our mise en place is all together, we heat the butter in the saucepan, and we're adding seasonings, and we're adding the poaching liquid. Could be wine, could be water, matched with a little vinegar or lemon juice in there as well. You guys place the actual fish in there. In this case, you can see the slice of salmon, the salmon steak that we have in here, and we go and bring that up to the correct temperature, so we're just gently poaching. We're going to cover that saucepan because we're looking to have steam be a part of the cooking process with this. Then after that, we're going to finish the food in the saucepan. We're going to take the possibly have some direct heat or placing it in the oven, depending on if it's required to get it fully cooked. You're going to remove that piece of fish from the poaching pan, reduce that poaching liquid to then prepare the sauce, plate, and garnish. So blanching. What is blanching? Here we're hitting another French word. To blanch means to part cook. It actually means blanc is white in French. So when we're blanching things like French fries, you'll actually see they go a silvery white color. When we're blanching other vegetables in water, then we're actually part cooking those, but we're also going to take control of this as well. We're going to shock them by plunging them into boiling water and then into ice water to stop the cooking process. Let's take a look and see how this works. Hey guys, Chef Hawks here again, and so today what we're looking at, we're going to be preparing some broccoli. I'm going to show you how to break this down into individual smaller florets, and we are going to go ahead and blanch and refresh it using hot water, boiling water, to make sure we hold on to all this wonderful, glorious green color, all the flavor, and as much of the nutritional value in this broccoli. Chef Hawks here again. So today we're going to be working with the humble potato. We're going to be making some French fries to go with the ketchup we've already made, our nice homemade ketchup. So let's start this off. So we see the two different methods of blanching there. So in this case, we're looking at part cooking for both of those types. In this case, though, we're now looking at things like vegetables, where we're looking at that broccoli. It's a two-step process where you're plunging that broccoli into that boiling water just for a couple of minutes, and then taking it out, shocking it by placing it into the ice water, and that refreshes it. That stops the cooking process. It chills it down very, very quickly, maintains the bright, gorgeous color you have on there, more of the nutritional value, and also all the flavor. Steaming. So this is something that you use. This is a cooking method that we use if we want to have something where we're not adding additional fats. It can be a very healthful way of cooking. So you can see right here we have a steamer basket right here with the legs right down the bottom. This would actually be placed directly inside a saucepan with a lid on it to trap the steam on it. And we'll just have water, maybe up to about the top level of where the basket legs go to allow the water to be just below a boil right underneath it, with a lid on top to just allow the steam to fully envelop around the food. The steam surrounds the food and slowly cooks it through. But there are a couple of different ways that we can do steaming as well. So we can cook with pressure or without pressure. So if it's without pressure, then that's with using that steam basket, like I mentioned. That's where the maximum temperature of that water can only go up to 212 degrees while it's not under pressure. If you were in a commercial kitchen setting, though, as we are in our kitchen, you may have a steamer or you may have a combi oven, a combination oven like we have in our kitchen. And so this gives you the ability to steam under pressure. It actually gives you the ability to cook very, very fast and even higher temperature than you would if you're just using steam in a basket in a saucepan. So steaming enhances the flavors of food. You can use things like broths and other liquids to actually steam the food in to give more flavor. Generally, you would use tender foods to be able to steam. They are well suited for that. And you're going to want to make sure you have small pieces so they cook fairly quickly, so that the outside edges of that food aren't overcooking and breaking down. You would very often have it on a rack above the liquid, as I showed you. And you don't remove that lid, because as soon as you open that lid, you actually release all of that steam, and then you'd have to place it back down to allow it to build back up again. So food keeps its nutritional value because it's not being boiled out. It's not allowing it to go into the cooking vessel that you're actually cooking the food into. You're not adding any additional calories because you're not adding any extra fat or oil to the food by steaming. It generally has a very mild and delicate flavor because you're not adding flavor to the food from the cooking medium. But you generally have a fresher taste to the food because it's not a processed flavor that you would taste if you're doing lots of other kinds of cooking methods. You're not really going to have that same kind of color that you would with other cooking methods. It's just going to hopefully be the nice bright appearance that you get from the natural food. Cooking time can be longer if you're steaming without pressure. When you're cooking it on top of the range, as you can see here, this is another basket that you can see, and it has the holes in here. This is actually sitting on top of and inside of a pan that has water at the bottom of it. You add the food in there, just a single layer. You don't want to have it where it's completely piled up, because you need to leave room for that steam to be able to move in between all the food. And then you cover the pot over and keep that lid on, keep it tightly on, until that food is cooked until the correct doneness. Serve immediately, serving with a sauce or a garnish. Well, now let's take a look at some combination cooking methods. So these are the ones where we're using both dry and moist cooking methods simultaneously as we cook certain items. And it's a great kind of cooking process that you can use for less tender foods if they need to have a little additional time, but without them drying out. So if we are braising large cuts of meat, large steaks and large cuts of meat, then you would want to, then we would call that braising. If we're doing small bite-sized pieces, then we call this method stewing. So let's take a look at both of them. So with braising, you're going to sear in hot oil. That's our dry cooking method. And then you're going to partially cover with a liquid. That's our moist cooking method. So as you can see right here, this meat is nicely browned because they were browned off first with the dry cooking method, and then they've had the liquid added to them, and you can see the rich, moist flavor that's just surrounding all of these as they're slowly cooking as well. You want to cover it tightly to maintain that moisture in there. You're going to finish it fairly slowly. That's where you're going to possibly either turn the temperature down on the oven top, on the stove top, or place it into the oven to slowly cook its way through whilst maintaining the moisture inside the pan. You're going to add any seasonings to it, and that can add more moisture and more flavor to the food itself. You would generally add a lot of the vegetables to these kinds of things towards the end of the cooking process so they don't turn into mashed vegetables by the end. You may be cooking these meats for a couple of hours, and so if you're putting vegetables in for a couple of hours, they may end up just falling apart before you actually get to serve them. So braising is perfect for when you have meats that have tough connective tissues, and breaking them down until they are literally fork tender to where you don't even need a knife to cut into them. Few nutrients are lost because everything is staying inside that pot. We're not throwing anything out of that pot or rinsing anything off afterwards. It would only be the nutrients that are susceptible to breaking down with heat that could be lost. You're going to be pot roasting. It is another name for it. That's the American term that we very often use for braising in this country. So how do we go about doing this? We preheat the pan with oil, and then we're going to sear the meat. We want to actually seal in all the juices, as you can see right here with our dry cooking method. We're adding mirepoix and tomatoes to that. There's the ponce mixture, and then we're going to deglaze the pan. This is where we're going to add the liquid into the pan, where you see this isn't burned on flavoring or juices from the food. It's caramelizing in there. This is all flavor. By adding the liquid gently into there, we deglaze the pan. This all gets lifted up off the bottom of the pan, so make sure that flavor goes into the sauce that we'll be creating around it. You're going to add the appropriate amount of liquid that you need. You're going to cover it and finish it. So that's where we're either going to turn the temperature down to slow cook it on the stove top or place it into the oven. Once that's fully finished, then we're going to reduce that sauce down. So that's when you can take the meat out and you can actually boil it to reduce that liquid level down, so that way you have a nice sauce to finish that up. So stewing, very, very similar to braising, but as you can see in the photograph here, we're doing small bite-sized pieces of everything, all around the same size so that they cook simultaneously together. You want to sear it again, just like we would with the larger pieces, or possibly blanch, depending on exactly what the items are. That's where you're cooking them in oil, the dry cooking method, and then we're going to cover it completely with a liquid of some sort, whether it's stock, wine, water, or a combination. That's our moist cooking method. We cover that over, we either turn the temperature down and slowly cook it on the stove top, or we put it into the oven to slow cook to finish. But let's work our way through this. So we cut into uniform pieces. We heat with fat in a rondo. So the rondo is a large, wide based pan. And then we're sauteing the ingredients, the other ingredients off as well. We want to brown all the sides of the meat that's in there. We're adding a roux or a thickening agent, possibly just adding flour directly to it to create a roux around the meat itself. Then we add that liquid in there. We're going to stir it to prevent any lumps from being created in there. We want to break that up so we have a nice smooth sauce that's created all around it. And then we're going to cover it over, and we're going to bring that up to the right temperature, just so that we're slowly cooking it, keeping that container covered so that we don't lose too much of the moisture content from there. And then we're going to remove the items and hold it properly, return the sauce up to a simmer and thicken it to wherever we need it to correct that sauce, seasoning it, and then heating the items and serving it all together. Sous vide cooking. So sous vide cooking, to some may be considered as a new modern type of cooking. However, sous vide technically has been going on for hundreds of years. Sous vide technically could be seen in when you're making jams, and you're actually cooking the jam in a jar under a vacuum. But in the more modern case, that's where we're vacuum packing foods, and we're actually cooking them in liquid with one of these systems in the hot water itself. So we have 4 of these in our kitchen that we get to use, and they're amazing to use because you can cook to a very, very specific temperature and degree to maintain the food that you're cooking. So you can cook food for a long time at a low temperature to slow cook in there, or you can actually do it where you're cooking at a higher temperature to control to exactly where you want it to be. Say, for instance, if you wanted to cook a steak, you could, and you needed to be able to cook that steak rapidly. As you can see in this third item right over here, you could have that steak cooking to about 130 degrees. You can then cut the bag open, place it into a boiling hot skillet, and just sear it one side, sear it the other side, and take it out. And now you have a perfect medium rare steak within a couple of minutes. It gives you the ability to cook things with absolute control and precision. It locks the flavor molecules in with the food as well, so we're not draining any of that flavor out from the product. So we've already mentioned microwave cooking a little, but microwaves alter the proteins. And so as you can see in here, the magnetron produces microwaves. They bounce around inside the actual cooking cavity of the microwave, but they very specifically will trigger and hit down on certain areas of the food. Now, if the food has water surrounding it, then it will probably steam it or it will boil. However, if you have foods which are maybe a chicken breast that's sitting straight on a plate in the microwave, then those direct microwaves can hit on a certain point of that chicken and can overcook that small piece of chicken, and can make it to where you have a rubbery, tough piece of meat. So it doesn't really cook very evenly, and that's our biggest problem with microwaves. They can be handy sometimes for certain things, they can be convenient, but really when it comes to cooking, it's not our preferred method of cooking. You cannot do any browning in a microwave because, as we said before, it's all about agitating the water molecules that are in that food, and that's what creates steam within the food. So there's no browning occurring with this method. It tends to unevenly cook. You need to make sure you only ever cook with glass, ceramic, or plastics in a microwave. Never putting anything like metal or foil in there because they can arc and they can zap on it. Or brown paper, grocery bags, or newspaper. They can actually catch fire in a microwave as well. So determining doneness. So we've talked a lot about this. We've hinted on a lot of all of this. But this is key to everything that we do with moist and dry cooking methods and combination cooking methods. So when we're cooking, we want to take it to the correct temperature. We want to have control. And so we have to make sure that through that control that we are cooking to minimum internal temperatures, which, especially for certain meats and fish, we have requirements for those so that we are making sure our food is safe. But we also want to make sure that it has the right kind of texture and consistency to that food as well. So that's where we come in to have recipes that call for specific temperatures and times for certain sizes. But this is where, whether it's going to be a large or a small quantity or individual portions, that we're always making sure that we're following directions that we have on there, and that we're considering things. If we're doubling the size of something, then it's going to take longer. But then we need to figure out another method of control so we can tell when food is done. We can never assume that things are done just because on the outside it looks like it's done. Because if you've been deep frying a piece of chicken breast until it was golden brown on the outside, what happens if that chicken breast was a fairly thick-sized chicken breast and it's not actually cooked to the center to the right temperature? So this is where we have to make sure we have control. One of those things can be temperature, where we're actually using a thermometer to check the temperature on the internal temperatures. So we also have to bear in mind carryover cooking. We already mentioned a little about this, but when you pull that big turkey or that big pot roast out of the oven, you have to know that there's a lot of heat energy still left in there, and so that will continue to cook for maybe another half an hour or so after it comes out of the oven. So that is what's called carryover cooking. So let's remind ourselves of the specific core internal temperatures that we must achieve. So when it comes to poultry, and this includes ground chicken, turkey or duck, it also includes stuffings that are made with TCS foods, time and temperature controlled for safety foods. These are our high-risk foods, like different meats, or it can be things like tomatoes as well. Anything that has food that bacteria love with the right conditions, the right amount of moisture, the right amount of of neutrality between acidity and alkaline. Just to have any of those food items in stuffing means you must cook it to this temperature too. Stuffed meats, seafoods, and poultry or pasta. So any of these that are stuffed, and then dishes that include previously cooked TCS foods must be reheated to this temperature, and that's 165. And so we always say for at least 15 seconds. That's because generally when you're measuring, especially if you're using a bimetallic thermometer, it's going to take about 15 seconds for it to get an accurate reading. Make sure you're accurate. Make sure you're going in on the thickest part of the meat to get an accurate recording of the core internal temperature. So then we dip down to 155. So at 155, this is where we had to cook any ground meats. So we're looking at things like burgers, including beef, pork, and other meats. Any injected meats, so these can be like hams and things like that have been injected with brine. Mechanically tenderized meats, so these are meats which are professionally tenderized or tenderized by us using a batting hammer and pounding that meat out. Must be cooked to at least 155. We're also looking at ground seafoods, including chopped or minced seafoods. Anytime you don't have a solid piece of seafood, must be cooked to 155. Shell eggs, so eggs that come directly from the shells that will be hot held for service. So it's going into a chafing dish. It won't be eaten immediately. We must hit 155. So then we go down to 145. So this is where we're going to be cooking seafoods, including fish, shellfish, and crustaceans, and also steaks, chops of pork, beef, veal, and lamb, and also shell eggs that are going to be served immediately. So if you're serving breakfast and you're pan frying a sunny side up egg, it only needs to be cooked to 145 if it's being served immediately. 145 is the needed temperature for things like large roasts of pork, beef, veal, and lamb. But notice we're saying for 4 minutes you need to get that accurate reading. Because we're dealing with a much bigger piece of meat, you may even want to take several readings just to make sure that it has fully reached its core internal temperature. Also bear in mind for a large piece of meat like this, you're almost certainly going to have some carryover cooking occurring. Then when we're looking at commercially processed, ready-to-eat foods that will be hot held for service, we only need to reach 135 for these items. These are a much lower risk. And also for fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes that are going to be hot held for service. So we covered a lot today. There's a lot to do with different cooking methods. This is one of the core parts of our subject that we play with, because the fact is, cooking in a kitchen, depending on wherever you are around the world, is different because we use different styles of cooking. But the wonderful thing is we can bring all these different styles together. We can learn about these different styles and learn about different cultures through these different cooking methods to really make some amazing food that may surprise a lot of your patrons. So I hope you enjoyed all of this. Please check in with me if you need any assistance on anything that we've discussed in here. And I look forward to seeing you in the kitchen soon. Cheers.